Hello, can you hear me? Okay, I think we're all settled. Just want to make sure that everyone can hear me. All right. Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Sam Loni, and I'm the Global Coordinator of SDSN Youth. SDSN Youth is the youth program of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is a program that was launched by the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to mobilize global expertise around the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. A huge thank you to the Sustainable Education Foundation, as well as Rotaract Sri Lanka, for inviting me to speak to you about the role of youth in the 2030 agenda. Now, before I go to explain about the 2030 agenda, I wanted to take this chance to give you a bit of context. So we are right now in the middle of a geological epoch known as the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is the age of human beings. It is where we as human civilization move more sediments, more soil, than all the waterways and rivers combined in the entire planet, where 90% of plant activity takes place in a location where humans have a significant impact. We have changed the geology of the planet so significantly that we're now in an entirely new epoch. So one fact that I find very fascinating is that human beings have been around on this planet for less than 1% of its entire life, and yet we have changed the planet so significantly. And that's what's called the Anthropocene. So 21st century is the century of the Anthropocene and the age of the Anthropocene. Secondly, we are also in the middle of the sixth mass extinction, where we're rapidly losing species of plants and animals, never to be seen again. And this is going to, of course, have significant impact on the livelihoods of the people who depend on biodiversity, on the plants and the animals, different species of animals. And it really threatens the livelihood of human beings, but also it makes the planet much less resilient in the face of dangers such as climate change. At the same time, we're also facing major challenges with pollution, whether that's water pollution or air pollution. Again, these are, in the case of water pollution, it's threatening the livelihoods by killing marine stock, but also it is linked into a lot of diseases. In particular, many of them are becoming, as the planet warms, many diseases are becoming waterborne. But also in major cities, and that's the idea of pollution. Now, when we look at pollution, we don't necessarily always consider the big issue in the current debates, because we look at the climate angle and the warming of the planet. But actually, a lot of research shows that pollution is one of major killers of human beings, and it's leading to a lot of respiratory diseases, especially in major cities. The World Health Organization has said that basically many mega cities, in particular, for example, Beijing during some periods, as well as Mexico City, have been almost uninhabitable. There are thousands of people who die as a result of the impact that the pollution has. Now, I also heard a statistic, which is in some of these mega cities where the pollution is so bad, going outside for a day is equivalent to smoking, say, 40 or 50 cigarettes. So you can just imagine what sort of impact that is. And of course, we've got the biggest threat of them all, which is climate change. As you know, we're almost over the carbon budget. And the carbon budget is essentially what estimates how much carbon we can put into the atmosphere before we go over the 2-degree threshold. And that's the safe planetary boundaries that we have. And at this stage, we are basically on our trajectory to breach those planetary boundaries, some of them by 2033, actually. And this is very significant because we are supposed to be decarbonizing and reaching net zero emissions by 2050. So you can see that climate change is also going to be the threat that just makes a lot of these problems worse. It's a threat multiplier. Now, climate change is also contributing to conflicts and development. Now, a famous example of this is, of course, Syria, where because of the drought that was caused in parts of Syria in the early to mid 2000s, this led to a lot of farmers leaving the cities, leaving the countryside and migrating to the cities. Because they didn't have livelihood because of the drought. A lot of their crops were dead, and now they didn't have food. They didn't have necessary food, and they didn't have necessary crops to be able to export and sell them. So this mass migration into the cities also caused a significant issue because the cities were not built to deal with such pressures. The cities were not designed to be able to handle the sudden migration of individuals because they were not resilient, because the government just failed to plan for them and manage. Whether that's to provide access to health, access to education, access to jobs, that's what all these people would be looking for when they migrate to the cities. So I think this added extra pressure. And then when the conflict happened because of the various political, social, and geostrategic reasons, and there were a whole lot of factors that went into why that conflict happened and the core causes of it. But I think the climate change helped exacerbate some dimensions of it, and in fact, in many parts, sort of served as a trigger. So you can see that climate change can actually, its impact is not just happening into the future and what could happen by 2033 and 2050, but what's happening this decade. And we're also, there was a really good infographic I saw yesterday, which shows the frequency of the hottest days that are happening. And in the past 2 decades, when I saw all the red spots, it was just horrific. So you can see the impacts of climate change, but also you can see the impacts of conflict. A conflict in Syria has led to the deaths of almost 1 million people, to displacement of tens of millions of people. And in addition to that, it has completely paralyzed the health and education infrastructure in some parts of the country. And the damage to the economy has been anywhere between 200 billion to 400 billion on some estimates. Not to mention 4 out of every 5 Syrians within a couple of years went into poverty. And life expectancy went from 76 years to 52, again, in the space of several months. So you can see the impact that conflict has on development. How are you supposed to meet the most basic needs of the population when the country is at war? And again, these wars are likely to become more serious and become more intense and more frequent because of the impacts of climate change. On top of all this, we still have some other major threats that are emerging. So, for example, a recent survey by Oxfam showed that 8 richest individuals on the planet own as much wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion poorest individuals. So imagine 8 individuals and the 3.5 billion poorest individuals. So that is the level of wealth inequality that the world faces today, where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and the gap between the rich and poor is growing, whether it is in countries or between countries. And when you have those 8 individuals owning as much wealth, you know there is something wrong with the system. Not only is that immoral, but it's also it's not very practical, because we know that it leads to financial shocks, it leads to financial crises, it leads to many social and economic issues. So it's just not a very good system to have, especially when you're dealing with so many different challenges that are coming up for us in the 21st century. Now, at the same time, you have approximately 1 billion people on this planet who are living on less than $2 a day. So when you have these 8 individuals that own this much money, and then you've got such a big part of the population that live on less than $2 a day, you can see where the issues lie. So, and what is extraordinary is that though, bringing those people out of extreme poverty is within reach. It doesn't require a massive investment. It requires a very small percentage of the global economy to be able to bring those people out of extreme poverty and help them beat the poverty trap that they live in. So these are all the issues, a spectrum of issues, which I think provides the context for the 2030 agenda, because these issues are what brought the world leaders in 2012 to Rio in Brazil, at the famous Rio conference, where they came together and they discussed how they would go and create an agenda that helps tackle or helps prepare us for these issues. So basically, from 2012 to 2015, till middle of 2015, for almost 3 years, world leaders, business leaders, academic experts, technical experts, children, youth, civil society organization, local governments, all got involved in one of the largest consultations in the UN's history on designing of an agenda that would serve to overcome a lot of these issues, or at least give us a plan for fighting these issues. So it was a very large and open consultation process, and a lot of people got involved. I think there were at some stage 84 national surveys, but ultimately it was the governments that negotiated this goal by goal, target by target. And eventually, after 3 years of consultation, millions of votes, and thousands of experts getting involved, and hundreds of committees, we came up with what we call the Sustainable Development Goals. 17 goals, 169 targets, and roughly 230 indicators. This is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And it is supposed to serve as a blueprint for the future. Now, when we talk about sustainable development, a lot of people just assume that sustainable development is about the environment. It is just about climate change. I mean, that's part of it, but that's not the entire story. Sustainable development is actually a very powerful principle. Sustainable development is defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs and goals. It's simple. It's a commitment to future generations. It is a commitment to ensure that future generations have good standards of living, have access to health and education, have access to clean water, have access to energy, and clean energy for that matter, but they're still doing all of these development within the planetary boundaries. It's about a system. And this is what the SDGs are, and that's what's extraordinary about them. The SDGs, or the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, is not simply about having a set of goals. It is about a system of goals, a network of goals that interconnect, because you can have impact on one goal and it will affect the other one. I just showed you examples of pollution and climate change and conflict, and then how that leads to development, issues with development, and also inequality, and how that leads to greater poverty and other forms of issues. So these goals were really a framework for guiding us and getting it together. And they're very powerful because you have, governments rarely agree on anything, but you have 193 governments who came together in New York in September and agreed to achieve these goals by 2030, agreed that these are the goals for our future, for the future of this planet. And many of them have labeled these goals as the most important agreement of the 21st century. Some are saying this is to the 21st century, this agreement is to the 21st century as was the Human Rights Declaration to the previous. So you can see the importance of this agreement. And of course, a lot of people say, well, the SDGs are nothing new. Why did we need 3 years of consultations and thousands of people to be involved and millions of people to vote in order to get some priorities together? We knew that poverty is bad and we need to eradicate it. We know, hunger is nothing new. Battling climate change, we know we've got to do that. So what is so significant? Why do we need a framework? Why do we need a set of goals to tell us that we need to do these things? Well, the Sustainable Development Goals have a practical purpose. Firstly, it gets the countries to agree on a common framework, and that's very important because it allows countries to actually assess where the world needs to go, and for those countries to take ownership of these goals, and that's why that's very important. Secondly, it allows you to actually be able to mobilize around a set of goals that are easy to understand, that are measurable, and that are time-bound. This is critical. When you have goals, you need to have a way to measure how you're doing that goal or how you're progressing along that goal. It allows you to reflect, it allows you to change direction, and it allows you to actually make decisions how to direct the financing, where you lack in the resources to be able to meet that goal. And also there's a time frame. So you are working against a time, and you know that if we don't give something a deadline, it will never get done. So it is a practical way of encouraging governments, but also different institutions to be able to actually work towards something. Governments, businesses, academic institutions all need a benchmark to set their policies. And the SDG framework enables them to do that because it has ways of measuring it. It's not just a set of aspirational goals. It comes with a very concrete set of indicators and targets which allow you to actually monitor progress bit by bit and look at data. This is why, alongside the Sustainable Development Goals, came the idea of the data revolution, because to assess this impact, you need the use of sustainable development data to show how you're progressing, and this is very important. So this is why the Sustainable Development Goals has been critical. Again, to achieve something, you might not necessarily have all the answers, but you set the goal in an effort to bring the different communities of practice, whether it's experts, academics, businesses, governments, to work towards a common goal. And one of those examples could be the moon landing. John F. Kennedy did not have the technology nor the necessary know-how to know that we want to go to the moon, but he made a commitment that we will go to the moon by the end of this decade. And then everyone gathered together behind that common goal and worked towards it to actually to make that dream a reality. And this is the model for the SDGs, goal-based planning. But despite all this, one major issue is that the SDGs are transformative. They are complex, and achieving them will require new ways of thinking. Achieving them will require an entirely new approach. And this is part of the problem, because I would say there are three qualities of the SDGs. One, they're very ambitious. So if you actually look at the wording on a lot of the goals, you will see that they're actually very, very ambitious and good. We need an ambitious agenda to drive us through this 21st century. Secondly, it's transformative. Again, it doesn't just look at one area and changing something small. It looks at a system. It looks at where the goals intersect, and to achieve something, it's basically wants to stay away from band-aid solutions. It looks at transformative and real reimagination of the problem and its solution. And thirdly, it is very inclusive in the sense that the official motto is leave no one behind. So it's not a thing just for the government, and it's not just a thing for corporations. It is something that requires an entire society approach. It cannot be done with one actor. Again, if you read the words and if you read all the targets and indicators, you'll realize that it is a multi-sectoral, multi-thematic, and multi-dimensional agenda that requires a whole society approach and a transformative approach. So these are the three important qualities of the SDGs. Now, a lot of you might ask, so what is a role that young people can play? How can young people contribute to this agenda? Now, a lot of people say that young people, this is their future, and they have a moral right to be sitting at a table in these discussions. And I think that's a very valid argument, and also practical in many circumstances. But I think the contribution of young people can go beyond that for the SDGs. It shouldn't be just about sitting at the table. I think the capabilities and the qualities that young people have can, in fact, make them one of the main stakeholders, or at least the individuals who lead this movement or spearhead it. And there are three reasons. Because I think there are three qualities that young people have which go really well with the three qualities that I mentioned about the SDGs. Firstly, young people tend to be incredibly idealistic. This is shown by a number of research papers. You will see that it's true by many of our other experiences. Some want to call it they're naive. But I think idealism is an important factor or important quality of young people in many parts of the world. And this is important because if we have an ambitious agenda, we will need an idealistic group to help achieve that. Someone who views things positively. As Mark Twain famously said, they didn't know it was impossible, so they went and did it. And I think that's a really good way of capturing why young people will be really good for this, would be well placed to be able to address the ambitious agenda. Secondly, it is the idea of transformation. Now, if you look at the text of the SDGs, even in the official title, it says a transformative agenda. As I said, to achieve a transformative agenda, you need new thinking. Now, there's a quality of young people is one of the most important qualities of young people, in fact, is creativity. Again, research shows that there are certain processes in the brain called fluid intelligence, which allows young people to think outside of the box. And frankly, to tackle these problems, we need that. Einstein famously said that you cannot solve problems with the same thinking that was used to start them. And this is why the creativity of young people is absolutely essential. We also know that they tend to be creative in the solutions they create. They're creating more social businesses, and they're making more innovations than all their counterparts. And again, this is very, very important. And thirdly, it is the idea of being inclusive and leave no one behind. The official motto of the SDGs, leave no one behind. Now, half of this planet's population is under the age of 30. That's more than 3.5 billion individuals. Now, these individuals will go to join the global workforce. They will become future consumers. They'll become future leaders, future politicians, future middle class. And I think it's incredibly important to first educate these large groups of people. There is that opportunity. And secondly, to use them as agents of change within their community. Remember, to achieve the SDGs, we need an entire society approach and to leave no one behind. Well, we've got more than 3.5 billion people under the age of 30 who are well equipped to deliver on that. And this is why I think young people can play a very significant role in the implementation of the SDGs, but also the Paris Agreement. And we know from all the big movements in history, and more recently with the movement for our lives, the March for Our Lives, and many revolutions, you always see that young people are at the forefront of this. And I think it's going to be no different with the Sustainable Development Movement, because if we're serious about achieving the SDGs and safeguarding our planet and remaining within the 2-degree threshold, then I think young people are not just a good, shall we say, allies to have on board, but critical partners in helping achieve this agenda. I think the true magic and the true transformation will happen when you have the creativity, the idealism, and the huge numbers of young people, and you match that with the influence, with the expertise, experience, and financial capacity of all the generations in an intergenerational effort, and that's when you get true transformation and success. And that is what I and many others, whether it's within the UN system, civil society organizations, are fighting to create a system where that is made possible. So I think that's about it. I think that gives an overview of the context of the SDGs, why they're important, why we need the goals, and how young people can actually contribute to them. I think we've got about 10-15 minutes. So if you have any questions, I would be more than happy to answer them. Okay, I'm just looking at this. Okay. So we've got a couple of questions here. Are the goals prioritized, ranked in any order? No, they're not. As I mentioned before, the goals are a network of targets. And in fact, if you look at through the goals and read through them and look at the targets, you will see that it's actually kind of impossible to achieve one without impacting the others, because the targets are just so interlinked and go across the many different areas. And they were designed on purpose in that way to basically force governments or to force different groups to break silos and think horizontally rather than just pick one goal and just work towards that and say, yeah, we achieved this because that's our own contribution. I think groups can still do what they're good at and specialize in one area, say poverty eradication or education, but it really helps when they identify what other impacts they're making. And it just encourages more partnerships and more collaboration and more systematic and transformative thinking, I think, in many cases. I hope that answers your question. So no, the goals are not ranked. I think this is more of a comment. I don't think the goals are prioritized. They're implemented on a local basis where the need is most. Um, I mean, it's very difficult to answer that question because it's a case by case basis. But I do think that a bit more emphasis on the goals need to be made because any individual or any institution in the world is going to wonder, are going to have basically the same three things run through their head. What are the goals? Why are they important? Or rather, in a more blunt way, why should I care? And thirdly, what can I do about them? And it's very important when we are trying to communicate a 2030 agenda, we make it clear what these goals are, why they're important, especially to that stakeholder, and what that stakeholder actually can do about them. And I think in the communication narrative, this is kind of missing, and we certainly should do more in emphasizing and allowing for people to have a better understanding and localization of the actual goals and targets. Okay, so the next question, isn't there extensive budgeting allotted for discussions and PR around the SDGs, i.e. the massive digital hoarding outside the UN headquarters during the launch? While this could be effectively utilized to strengthen concrete action and capacity building. Yes, I mean there are efforts for communicating the SDGs, but I think to keep them in the news cycle and get institutions and organizations to take action, I think takes another kind of approach. You see, awareness is not just an issue. Just because we tell someone what the goals are, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to take action on them or it's going to mean anything to them. You can try it, go on the street and tell people about them. What impact is that going to make other than them just being aware? Now, being aware is the first step, but it's not the only step. The second step, every human being, implicitly or explicitly, is going to wonder is, okay, there are these goals. Why should I care? How is it relevant to me? And I think that's the other critical question that we need to answer. Then the third one for them to take action is, what can I do? I'm a farmer in East China. What can I do? I am a mother from Southern United States. What can I do? I am a young professional working in Sydney in Australia. What is my role? And I think that's very important to specify. So the other comment is, getting young people to sit on a conference isn't engagement. Providing them financial resources, legitimacy, and training to take concrete action is. I couldn't agree more. I think getting young people to sit in conferences is good and important, and it is a good way of keeping them in the discussions. And that doesn't necessarily achieve outcomes. That a lot of groups have come and say, in many cases, that's considered tokenism, using the young people just a token person in the room to say, yes, we're engaging young people. But really, what does engagement mean? Are we there to just hear their opinion, and why? Just to hear their opinion and ignore it? Or are we actually serious about taking steps to ensure that those individuals, those young people, can go back to their communities and they're equipped with the right financial resources, with the right training and skills to be able to actually achieve an outcome on the ground? And this is, I think, what's lacking. So spot on. In what way do the SDGs differ from the Mdgs? I think that's a very good question. So as you know, the Mdgs came into effect in 2002. So basically, world leaders gathered in the year 2000 under Kofi Annan, may he rest in peace. He just passed recently. So under his leadership, world leaders came together and achieved the Millennium Declaration. At the time, there were no goals involved in the Millennium Declaration. A couple of years later, to achieve the Millennium Declaration, a lot of experts came together and created the Millennium Development Goals, which were predominantly single goals with small targets focusing on development, and they were predominantly, or I should say entirely, for the developing world. They didn't apply to how we say rich countries. They apply only to the low-income countries. And they weren't designed in a consultation process, and they weren't designed with governments coming and negotiating. They were just created as a set of metrics. The SDGs are fundamentally different. They were created in an intense negotiation process that expanded for 3 years, large consultations with lots of expertise and different governments taking ownership and being involved. The MDGs are single goals. The targets are very specific, more specifically related to that goal, so very sort of lateral, whereas the Sustainable Development Goals, as I said, are quite horizontal and they are very interlinked. Of course, there are more Sustainable Development Goals. The MDGs didn't take into account conflict, peace, and justice. The MDGs didn't take into account renewable energy and the climate change side of things. The MDGs didn't take into account economic development, wealth inequality. So there were many pieces missing from the MDG puzzle. And I think this was significant because we started to realize that with these missing puzzles, it makes it very difficult to actually achieve the MDGs. Without stopping conflict, it's very hard to reach Millennium Development Goals. So the MDGs had a number of missing pieces, and the SDGs sort of came in and tried to fill that gap. Also, the MDGs were a little bit more about single issues, whereas the SDGs look at a much more transformative and much more ambitious way of tackling those issues. Despite all this, the MDGs, and according to UNDP, created the biggest anti-poverty movement in history. So that is a lesson learned from the MDGs, and that has been applied now to the Sustainable Development Goals. So those are the main differences. I hope that makes sense. What opportunities are there for youth who work in sustainable development related work to be engaged with each other globally? I think there are many groups and organizations that are working in this space globally, connecting young people. SDSM Youth certainly does that across various programs. We offer volunteer opportunities to young people hoping to create an impact and also develop their own skills and their own capacity in this space, but also to actually do community leadership. We also offer membership to youth organizations and student associations working on the ground on the SDGs, and a number of other programs. There is also the UN Major Group for Children and Youth, which is doing wonderful work, and many, many other groups internationally in this space that are working to connect young people to help achieve the SDGs. And they always need more support and more volunteers, because at the end of the day, we're all a group of people who are working together to kickstart a sustainable development movement. I think there's one last question. My apologies, I may have missed that. So I think this question is about, should we have a top-down approach for the SDGs or a bottom-up approach? And I think there are many ways to look at that. Firstly, bottom-up approach, critical. You need people on the ground, because again, this is a transformative agenda, so you need people to actually take action from the bottom. And this is why a lot of civil society organizations have taken the goals as their own mission to achieve it, despite whether the government is stepping forward or not. And a recent analysis, in fact, shows that, proves that we need to have bottom-up approach as well, because there is a report we release annually here at the SDSN called the Sdg Index, which ranks countries according to the SDGs, and actually tries to identify where are the gaps, which countries are falling behind in which area. Australia falling behind in environment, another country falling behind on goal 2. So it gives us an ability to actually understand where they're falling. But overall, the overall trend is that countries are not on track to achieve the SDGs by 2030. And this is why the bottom-up approach is critically important if we are going to achieve these goals, because we cannot just rely on governments. And this is why a lot of groups are already taking steps and are making the goals their mission, regardless of what the government is doing. That's not to say the government doesn't have a responsibility and shouldn't be kept accountable. They absolutely should. They signed this and they made a commitment. But on top of that, I think groups should also be thinking beyond what just that immediate government could do. Now, the other thing I would want to emphasize is that in the Sdg Index and dashboards, which I encourage you to go look, and you will find the ranking of your country. So the website is sdgindex.org, and we create it every year and we do the analysis. You could, and it's important not to just look at the goals, where you're falling behind on the goals, but also on the specific indicators. Now, if there are young people hoping to start social businesses or to create organizations or to run campaigns to achieve the SDGs, what I would do is I would go to your country's profile, find out where your country is falling most behind. What is it? The environment? Is it renewable energy? Is it ecosystem? Is it biodiversity? Is it food? Is it agriculture? Where is your country falling behind most of the SDGs? And then I would find the indicators, not just where as a whole area, but specifically in what aspect of that area is it falling behind. And then I would use that as a guideline for creating my next venture, for my next social business, my next campaign, my next project, because we need people to step up and close those gaps. And I think the Sdg Index provides a really good opportunity. Now, you might ask, you also need the resources and the training and the skills to be able to, once you come up with a project, to scale it. And I can tell you that our solutions team is in the process of creating an online community for young innovators, young leaders, and young entrepreneurs to come together to get some training, to have access to mentors and experts in sustainable development, but also to funding opportunities, and also to really connect and learn from one another in an effort to build up their projects and scale it. So this community will be launched at the end of October. So please go to the SDSN Youth website, sign up to the newsletter, and you will receive updates about this. And when the community is online, we hope that all of you will come and get involved. Okay, I think we don't have time for more questions because we have to wrap this up. But there is one quick one I'm going to answer, the last one, which is, what is the plan after 2030? We have the SDGs, which is the agenda by 2030. But on top of that, we also have another agreement, which is called the Paris Climate Agreement, which is more specifically about net emissions, so decarbonizing the energy system by 2050. Now, that doesn't necessarily answer your question of what happens after 2030, because we don't know. We don't know. But I think we don't have the luxury to find out what happens after 2030 if we don't take serious and concrete actions now. As I said, we're almost over the carbon budget. We've got these major issues coming up, and this is one chance at sustainable development. One. People are not going to as easily rally behind another set of goals if they know this one failed. So we get one chance at this. That's my fundamental belief. So I don't want to even think about what happens after 2030 at this stage, because the focus is the pathway to 2030 and what we're able to achieve in the next 12 years. I think time is running out. But one thing makes me very hopeful is that we've got young, talented, and wonderfully optimistic and creative individuals who are standing side by side with me and other colleagues, and as a network, as a movement of youth working towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And that makes me very, very hopeful. Once again, a huge thank you. Please reach out to me if you have any questions or want to clarify. Sorry I couldn't answer all your questions, but I hope this has been helpful. A huge thank you to the Sustainable Education Foundation and Rotaract Sri Lanka. Have a great morning, afternoon, and evening.